Hi, my name is Marianne Krasny, and I'm at Cornell University. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Natural Resources. And what I wanted to talk to you about today was really climate change, but the questions that climate change raise in my mind vis-a-vis environmental education. So it's sort of like, as an environmental education professional, and now we have climate change, what am I thinking about, or what should we be thinking about? And so basically, I think of climate change actions as mitigation, so that's reducing our carbon footprint, and adaptation, which is adapting to the inevitable changes that are being brought about by climate change. And I think that environmental education has a history of focusing on things that are consistent with mitigation. So for example, if we're trying to reduce our water use or conserve wetlands, we're always trying to improve the environment and reduce our impact on the environment. But the problem with climate change is that there are changes that are already occurring, and we have to adapt to them. And so we can't just do mitigation, just reduce our footprint. I think we also have to think, even though I hate to do it, about adaptation. But some forms of adaptation are really not consistent with environmental values or with our values as environmental educators. So for example, if we were to build a concrete seawall, it might help a community to survive sea level rise or storm surge or some other kinds of catastrophic flooding event. But a seawall also can destroy wetland habitat, can destroy mangroves, is not really doing anything to improve environmental quality. So the IPCC published State of the Climate report in 2015, and they have several chapters on adaptation. And they talk about different adaptation options. And I think that some of these adaptation options are actually consistent with environmental education and our values of improving environmental quality. And some of them are not so consistent. So for example, under physical adaptation, there could be things like building a seawall, but there's also things like ecosystem-based adaptation, which are adaptation options that help to improve our environment, or they're based on ecosystem principles. So example, instead of building a seawall, we could install artificial oyster reefs and try to restore oyster populations, which then may build up our barriers, our defenses against storm surges, but in a way that also brings other environmental values and improves environmental quality. Another form of adaptation is community-based adaptation. And that's where the community is involved in helping with the adaptation options. So again, if we go back to our oyster example, or we could use a mangrove restoration example, it would be a program where people in the community are involved with helping to restore mangroves, helping to plant the mangroves, helping to place the artificial oyster reefs and the baby oysters in those reefs, and maybe monitor their survival. So that's community-based adaptation. You can see that it overlaps with ecosystem-based adaptation. And there's other kinds of adaptation options that I think are consistent with environmental education. We could talk more about these, like institutional adaptation, those that involve multiple forms or multiple governance agencies and nonprofit organizations involved in figuring out some of the best adaptation options, and the sort of idea of polycentric or environmental governance, or multiple organizations involved in governance decisions. That might be another adaptation option called institutional adaptation that's consistent with improving environmental quality, at least in some cases. So I think these are things we need to think about, is what adaptation options are consistent with our environmental education values. I don't think it's totally clear-cut. For example, you might have a seawall that's protecting a valuable, say, estuary habitat from being flooded. So these are just issues we need to think about, and but I think the important lesson is that as environmental educators, we really value, our whole profession is around improving environmental quality. And this presents some challenges as we deal with climate change and adaptation. So let's not give up with the mitigation side of things, and let's think carefully and critically about adaptation options and which ones are consistent with our profession.